How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the Greatest City in the World podcast. It has been quite some time since I've done a podcast, and have today something really unique. The coronavirus obviously has made it so one-on-one in the same room podcasts have dropped, I think, across the entire industry. But I have with me not just someone from Kittanning or Armstrong County, but I have someone with me joining all the way from Ukraine. I have Adrian here today. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself, and then we'll kind of enter into deeper conversation, because I don't know, how does Ukraine and Kittanning get connected here, Adrian?
Well, I am an American who's been living in Ukraine for 15 years now. Adrian Zawada. I've been working here as a journalist and a political analyst. And how did I come across Kittanning of all places? I've been my children were born here, but they're U.S. citizens, and we want my wife and I, my lovely wife and I, Veronica, want to raise our children in the U.S. so that they have traditional American values. And these are values that I noticed living abroad are unique. Contrary to what many on the left think, American values are actually quite respected throughout the world. Americans still, to a large extent, although that's gradually deteriorating, but to a large extent still command respect throughout the world because of our commitment to such Western values as rule of law, private property rights, freedom of speech, Christian values.
A lot of things we take for granted here.
Some of the values that, what's that?
A lot of things that we take for granted here in the United States, I think, sometimes.
Especially when, and I might have taken them for granted as well before I lived in a place like Ukraine, which is a post-Soviet country, where things like rule of law, private property rights, individual rights, economic stability are all lacking. And when you see that firsthand, you start to really appreciate the country that you were born in. I was born in New York City, which some people might say isn't really America. But there are American values, definitely when I was growing up in the 80s, it was apple pie still, I would say.
Yeah.
In Queens, I was in Queens, it's not Manhattan, so there are a lot of families there. It's still like a family-oriented place. But, even to this day, New York, it represents capitalism, competition. So that's also an traditional American value.
Yeah.
And so even New York shares some of that. When in considering returning to the U.S., New York is not on my list. Unfortunately, I would have liked to have my children grow up in my hometown and walk the same streets that I did and enjoy the same things I did, like Boy Scouts and Little League and whatnot. But it's just even before the events of this year, I didn't want to do it, and the events of recent months have convinced me even more that I don't want to raise my children in New York.
Yeah, so you've been searching now, looking at different areas of the country, and I know you had a couple that are on your short list, and one of them came up, Western Pennsylvania, and then how'd you stumble upon Little Kittanning?
Yeah, I don't want to disappoint you. I did of all the cities that came to mind here in Ukraine, Kittanning didn't just wasn't in my memory at all. But Pittsburgh was. I'll say Pittsburgh was.
Absolutely.
I've never lived east of the Mississippi. I've lived in North Carolina and Florida, but never east of the Mississippi. So I was looking for a place that's fairly red state, fairly traditional east of the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Something that I'm more familiar with, this territory. And Pittsburgh came to mind. Mm-hmm. And the way I also confirmed that was I was looking at electoral maps of which states voted red and which counties voted red in particular.
Yeah.
Now, Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is situated, it did go blue. But aside from that, all of Western Pennsylvania was red.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know this, but which county was the most red?
Yeah, I mean, Armstrong County had to be up there. I think we were almost 80-20 red here. And then I think recently...
That's how I stumbled what's that?
Another interesting fact, they just had gun ownership as far as like Second Amendment rights. Armstrong County, I believe, was third in the nation for most gun ownership in one county. So it's a very, very red state, or very red county.
I did not know that. That's another plus.
Yeah. Well, that's so cool. I know then you contacted me after I think you saw a couple of videos, and
I typed Kittanning in Google.
Yeah.
And your videos came up. So
nice. Well, that's good. I know that was one of the motivations for me starting the YouTube channel, because when I would type Kittanning into Google, I would always get one random like news story of something terrible that happened here, because we didn't have a good city website, we don't have a good anything from a marketing standpoint, and so I was like, well, at least something positive will come up about Kittanning if I can get some traction. So I'm glad it worked.
You're making a difference. You're now changing the world since you're talking to me, right?
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, what's your perspective of like, I'll say as a microcosm, Kittanning, but maybe on a bigger level, small town America. You're thousands of miles away from here. You've been maybe not as connected over the past decade or so. What's your feeling about small town America and the kind of the potential that it has? Like, why do you want to come back? I mean, aside from the values, and we talked about that, but
the only time where I got to see what I would call the real America, the legacy America, I would even say, is when after I graduated university, I went to university in D.C., another gigantic metropolis.
Yeah.
I was starting out in journalism, and unless you have a relative who's an editor at one of the top newspapers or news channels, you're going to go to a smaller mid-sized market to start learning the trade. And I ended up in outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a town called Gastonia. And that was my first encounter with, I guess you could say it's a small town. And what I noticed in my travels, because I said I lived in North Carolina and Florida as well, is that there are small towns that are doing very well and have vibrant activity socially, economically, religiously, whatnot. And then there are those small to mid towns that for one reason or another got dealt a bad hand, and they're struggling.
Yeah.
So it's a mixed bag, and obviously one wants to, if one is wanting to relocate to a small mid-sized town, you want to get one that's at least in the middle, not necessarily struggling or suffering, but not, obviously you want the best for yourself and your family. But I think what's made it, the events of recent weeks and months has made it all the more obvious that of all the potential benefits of living in a smaller mid-sized town. I don't even have to say them. I think it's obvious to everyone. I think this summer there's going to be just a huge exodus from these giant mega cities of New York, Washington, Los Angeles, the list goes on.
Yeah.
Towards smaller mid-sized towns.
Well, it's really interesting if you look at kind of the overall economics of the last several decades. You had, the kind of the death of the small farmer, and so you have the farming communities gradually moving into the bigger cities, and kind of this all the cities getting bigger and all the small towns gradually dying. And then you had the manufacturing base kind of slowly being taken down. And then when you don't have that manufacturing skill, the manufacturers that were left just wanted to be next to the big population bases as well. And so you had this kind of like perfect storm of things that were really the death blow to a lot of small towns. But now, like you said, with you have the virus that is, predominantly in the major cities. I think people are looking to get out. You have kind of the return of this small farm mentality, where you're seeing all these market gardens and farms, and this interest of people my age that want to do homesteading, which is like lost for a couple of generations. And then you have also manufacturing is taking this big turn from big manufacturing to now small manufacturing is viable again. Small specialized manufacturing, especially in the United States, seems to be making somewhat of a comeback. So it's interesting. You had this perfect storm of people going away from small towns, and now you have people like you. You're a talented individual that could be working in a big city, but the internet has made it so you can work anywhere in the world. And so why would you want to subject yourself to big city life when you could have your cake and eat it too, so to speak?
And especially with the virus situation, encouraging employers to have their workers work at home.
Right.
And that's going to exponentially move the trend towards living in outside of the metropolises. I think I've seen articles in recent weeks in the mainstream media about that, John, about that very topic. People are starting to ask themselves, okay, well, I do 70% of my daily activity on the internet. Besides working, I do shopping on the internet. I socialize on the internet. And so why am I paying these high property taxes in these blue cities that encourage negative behaviors among its population? People are definitely giving second thought, and I think we're going to see quite a fascinating revival of small town America in the next, not only beginning in September, but also throughout the next few years.
Yeah, very, very interesting. How do you, from your perspective, I know we talked about a couple of different things about when you and your wife looking for places to live, and how, she had kind of this desire of a European town that's very walkable and those kinds of things. I'm looking at Kittanning, obviously, but small towns in general. What things do you see that a small town needs to have in order for it to be viable for someone moving from a city? How can a place like Kittanning capitalize on the opportunity that is presenting itself right now?
That's a great question, and every individual is going to have a different answer. I grew up in New York City, which is it's probably the most pedestrian-friendly city in America, I would say. There's even a joke among New Yorkers that, it's not even a joke. I know people I grew up with who don't have a driver's license, and they're 43 years old.
Right.
So they've never driven a car, and that's kind of it's been like a cultural joke for decades now. Woody Allen would joke about that in his films. It's like, he not only did he not drive, like when he tried to drive, it was just resulted in accidents. But so I would initially say, like what you said, having a pedestrian-friendly downtown area. However, that's for those of us who grew up with that, and that appeals to them. Like also my wife, who's from Europe, and Europe is obviously it's high. Europeans live in very compact cities, and the cities are old. They were built centuries ago, so everything's pedestrian friendly, and they're also very ecologically conscious as well. So they want to limit their use of automobiles, and in places like Germany and Denmark, I mean, like bicycle use is prevalent. I mean, it's a normal thing. It's what most, I don't say most, but a significant part of the population is how they travel is by bicycle and mass transit. They'll take their bike to a train, and then the train will take them to the next city, and then they'll take their bike off the train and then bike. So those. If an American small town can offer a half decent downtown, because I've seen some of the American downtown. I was a journalist in the U.S. working in North Carolina. I was in Winston-Salem also. I remember talking to the local economic development officials, and it was a real struggle for them to kind of get their downtown to become active after 6 p.m., where everyone just packed into their cars and headed out.
Yeah.
But if a small town can offer that, that puts them into a whole new league. I mean, if you look at, like, I'll just say one more thing and let you talk. There's like all these surveys I noticed when I did research on Google, like best places to live 2019 and best there's like at least 5 or 6 major surveys like that kind of rate like places to live in the U.S. And the one thing that would put places like Fayetteville, Arkansas, it's ranked in the top 5 in most of these surveys, and it's a fair, I would say it's a small town, but it's okay. It's a mid-sized American, like 500,000 plus minus.
Yeah.
So, and why is it up there? Because of it's pedestrian friendly. It's like a walkable city.
Yeah. Yeah, we did a lot of research on best small towns in America, and my friend Mike and we went through a lot of that stuff, and he's actually the one who just started the coffee shop. Because as we were going through, we were looking at, what are the things that people are looking for if they're moving from a big city to a place like Kittanning, specifically for reasons of cost of living, which I think is one of the biggest pluses that we have here, is like the fact that you can buy a house for such an inexpensive price. So if you're coming here for that, what are the things that are like the things you have to have? And it came up with a few different things. Coffee shop was actually really high on the list because I think people, they're used to getting their Starbucks or better, from wherever. And so you have to have good coffee. We now have like 2 places that I think we have one that's like a drive-through that's good coffee, and then Ispiare is just out of this world good. So. And then some of the other ones were like some kind of arts presence, because I think a lot of times people in a more conservative area kind of can get this rap of being kind of backwards and not cultural and all those kinds of things. And so if you can increase the presence of the arts. And then another one that came up also was farmers markets. I was surprised to see that on the list, but people wanted to be able to buy like fresh produce from somewhere other than a Walmart. They wanted to have access to like good local food, and I wasn't expecting to see that on there, but so those are all the kind of things that we're working on in Kittanning to try to like increase the presence of those, to make this like not such a culture shock if you were coming from some of the nicer areas of Pittsburgh or the arts district in Pittsburgh, that you wouldn't be like, wow, these people are all backwards in Kittanning. Trying to like slowly figure that stuff out.
Does Kittanning have like an economic development council and like a kind of like a leader who goes out and try to recruit companies and that sort of.
We don't. From a borough perspective, we don't. The county does, though. So the county is actively trying to bring in. They've been focusing more, though, on the kind of industrial complexes. So they're searching for manufacturing and those kinds of things to fill up those areas. But I know there are some talks in the works of how do they do the downtown revitalization from a county level. So. I know specifically there's a couple projects that are in the works, but nothing concrete yet. But yeah, they're working on it.
It definitely. The other thing, what you mentioned, the other big issue for people my age, I'm 43 years old, with a family of three children, is property taxes. We can't. A lot of people in Generation X can't afford high property taxes that usually come along with living in suburbs of large cities. New York, Atlanta, Washington. If you want to live in the suburbs, or even in the city for that matter, but definitely in the suburbs, you're not going to be able to afford the property tax. That's why these exurbs have emerged, which is like the outer ring of these cities where you have to commute at least an hour and a half, but usually 2 hours to reach the center.
Yeah.
So, like in New York, to go from Manhattan, there's like an exurb that emerged that's like 2 hours away, and there's people who actually do that commute. And so for people like us, it's like we definitely have to look for alternatives, and also if we want to stay on the east of the Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
Because I guess there's places west of there's a lot of options west of the Mississippi. There's a lot of cities that are affordable, but east of the Mississippi, you're going to be hard pressed.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit different, and I think it's really it's hard for a town like Kittanning because you have a lot of things that have happened over the years that have decreased the tax base. We used to be a town twice the size that we are now, and so when you have we have the same amount of infrastructure that we had then. But we now have half the tax base, and I think it's been an extraordinary challenge for local leaders, which has created turmoil, which has made it even more challenging. And so they're trying to do the same amount of services with half the tax base, and so ultimately then taxes continue to rise. And so it's like we have this chicken and egg scenario where we're like, well, we need lower taxes, but we need more people to do that, but we can't draw people if we have high taxes. And so it's really, really a conundrum for the small towns.
But wait, you said the city limits themselves aren't very wide. Like the city itself is actually, you can walk like across the city in a half hour.
Yeah.
Walking, right?
Yeah, you could walk from end to end. Yeah, if you walked just one side to the other, it wouldn't even take you 10 minutes if you're going east and west. North and south would be about a half hour. So
you're talking about the tax base within that tiny area.
Well, it's that, and then it's also the county because a lot of our taxes are derived from the school district, and so our school district encompasses both Kittanning, Ford City, and the surrounding area. And so if we're all paying into that same school district and we have a similar amount of teachers, we used to have a similar amount of buildings, although they've started to bring that down, and administrative costs continue to rise, and population doesn't. It's tough on that level as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then so it feels like I think to the people that have lived here for 40 years and they watch manufacturing leave, they watch these things happen, and they've heard over and over again kind of these promises of revival or hey, try this or try this, and it hasn't worked. You kind of end up with this kind of mentality of doom, and you don't feel like you can ever get out of it. And that's maybe like one of the most interesting things that we talked about. Like you've been in Ukraine, And Ukraine has been through some, like, I don't know any other way to put it than like tragedy. Like there's just,
Devastating times.
yeah, devastating things in Ukraine. And so you've seen what that can collectively do to society. I mean, can you speak to that just a little bit from your perspective of what Ukraine's been through? For those that don't know, like you give us a real overhead view, and then like what did that do to the people?
You know, when foreigners come here, especially from the West and especially from America, the first thing that they notice, they ask, like, why are you people so sad?
Wow.
I mean, Ukrainians and Russians are known for just not being the most, lighthearted, happy-go-lucky types of people. And there's a reason for that. I mean, there's a reason why Americans act the way they do, that, Ukrainians act the way they do, any country of the world. There's a common history of a people, and that affects their behavior, their common values, norms, language, and everything, behavior. And so when I arrived here, I knew about the history that the Soviet Union, what the Soviet Union was, which is, communism. For those of us old enough to remember that, because I know the younger generations, they weren't even around for the Soviet Union when it was the worst enemy that had to be defeated, as it was for us growing up, right?
Right.
And so the Soviet Union was bad enough, like living in those conditions where your freedom was highly restricted, you had limited access to goods. I mean, it was like constant suffering. But when it collapsed, it made things even worse, because people did have savings, by the way, in the Soviet Union, because you really couldn't buy a whole lot, so you just stored stuff in the bank. But when it collapsed, people lost their tens, if not hundreds of millions of people lost their savings when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Wow.
And it was a traumatic experience. And then coupled with the unemployment, the transition to a market economy, corruption, crime related, gangs forming, competing for, there was like just wild capitalism in the 90s, where gangs were just taking control of properties because it was all state owned. And then it all had to become privatized, but instead of it happening in a orderly basis, it was just a free-for-all.
Wow.
So by the time I arrived in 2005, I mean, people were very traumatized by all this. And the advantage for those of us coming in, and I was just a journalist, but there were business people coming in. Now, there were minuses to being a business person, because you didn't know all the little tricks and the chaotic environment of doing business. There's a lack of rule of law. The courts were all corrupt. But the positive that outsiders had coming in was that they didn't have that shared trauma that the locals had. So if you said, hey, well, why don't we do A, B, and C, and they'd say, no, you can't do it that way. And you're like, well, why not?
Yeah.
And because we just don't do it that way.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, maybe it's time to try it. You don't want to blame them for saying you can't do things this way, because that's just human nature, is to kind of establish a certain way of doing things in your society, and a way of talking about things, and a way of dealing with things that help you to survive a certain period. But to move forward, I think that's when you have to. They're innovators. They're creative people who emerge, and if they don't emerge within that society, then they come from outside that kind of lead the way forward. Right. I'll just give you one quick example. There is one of the most famous people in Ukraine is a Pakistani guy who came here Yeah, he went to Donbass where the war is happening, and he developed methods of taking the resources produced. It's a highly industrial region with a lot of steel making and coal mining and a lot of that, which is part of why the war is being waged there for control of that area. But he was able to set up in the early 90s when all the locals were just dealing with the trauma of the collapse. He was on the ball, just forming trade relations, forming business ties, and selling their steel products, their pipe products, their and he became a millionaire within years. And because he was able to come in and not be bound by the loss, the negative thinking that was prevalent in that area.
And I look at, the same thing that's happening there. My assumption is that a lot of the people from Ukraine, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you have all these different things that happen. And now, even in today's, they have to kind of feel like pawns between the West, like this proxy war between the European Union and the United States and Russia, and like the kind of this feeling of helplessness. And I look at Kittanning, and obviously we haven't been through war, we haven't been through a lot of those different things, but I do feel like there are similarities there that I feel like people in Kittanning, especially the older generation that went through a lot of those different things, they feel like pawns between kind of this manufacturing war between emerging nations and corporate government and the the federal government as well, and they're trying to figure out people feel helpless, and so when you get to that point, you aren't able to kind of take in your surroundings for what they are, and you're not able to see the opportunities amidst all of the chaos, and so. That when I came to Kittanning for the first time, I was like, "This place is great. The cost of living is so low, and I can buy a building to do a business in, and I can do all of these things that I could never do in Pittsburgh." And everyone just looked at me like, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy? Like, how do you see opportunity here?" And I still see it. I still see opportunity, but like you said, sometimes it takes a fresh set of eyes, or it takes a new generation to rise up to be able to see the opportunities around you.
Yeah, there's a Bible verse. I mean, Jesus felt it himself. He said, only in his hometown and his own house is a prophet without honor.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Which can be interpreted in various ways, but the way I see it is like when you're the place where you grow up in is what forms your worldview. It's not only obviously your family does, but also your town or your neighborhood or your community. And when you're part of that, it's not only hard to see things in a new way, but if you do come back and try to introduce something new, they say, "Oh, that's Jesus. He's the carpenter who, fixed my door 10 years ago." And it's people have kind of like this negative way of viewing a person who has grown, who has blossomed into something new and has learned new things, and they're partly resentful, perhaps partly jealous that, okay, you think you're special now, but 15 years ago you were just, I was changing your diapers or whatever.
Right.
So that's why, like, when a prophet comes from somewhere else, people are more apt to respond to that. They'll be very resistant at first, but the smarter ones are like, okay, well, maybe this guy has a point. I want to mention one thing about Pittsburgh is that apparently, from what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, how Pittsburgh was able to transition from a steel town to a high-tech hub is through its universities. Like it has Carnegie Mellon, most notably, but there's several others, and they were the ones that helped the city through this transition. I don't know if there was like a hugely traumatic experience in Pittsburgh, or whether they were able to softly kind of maneuver through that. Maybe you could highlight some of that.
Yeah, I know Pittsburgh. With the steel industry, when it collapsed, I mean, there was a huge blow to the city. But yeah, you're right with the universities, and maybe that's part of it. The universities are drawing in all kinds of people from outside areas, and they have all of these different disciplines. And the whole point of university, at least what it should be, in my opinion, would be to collect as many different perspectives as possible, as many different worldviews as possible, and begin to think outside your box and really learn how to learn. And I think places, especially like Carnegie Mellon, that have done a lot of forward-looking things with robotics and self-driving and AI, and then University of Pittsburgh as well with a lot of their medical breakthroughs. They have been able to transform the economy from this heavy manufacturing city to a place that is a lot more culturally diverse, and now drawing in all of these tech companies. Like you have self-driving cars on the city of Pittsburgh is like a really big test bed. And if you've seen the roads here, man, there's not a better testing ground or a better challenge for a self-driving vehicle than Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, it's really cool to see those kinds of things happen. But I think a lot of it is exactly what you're saying. I don't think we necessarily solved it from the inside. I think it was a lot of like bringing outside ideas in and just beginning to think different about the problems that we face. Now, Pittsburgh has a lot of bigger pool to draw from as well. So if they have the whole region here, a couple million people to draw from, whereas Kittanning or Armstrong County, we're talking 5,000 people or 60,000 people. But at the same time, the scale of the problem is a lot less as well. So if you're not trying to turn a city of 1 million people, we're trying to turn a city of 5,000. So that's a positive too. So I guess I'm just always optimistic about everything. If we could get a couple people like yourself that have outside ideas that I mean, who knows where you're going to end up? But if you would end up in Kittanning, man, what an amazing thing! What an amazing story to tell the people around town. Like, hey, there's some good stuff happening here, and we already have some of those stories. But I think each one is a snowball that begins to move you in the right direction.
And what I notice is Kittanning doesn't have that university system anchor that would have helped in the transition.
Yep.
So there has to be just a different approach. When I was working I was in Lakeland, Florida, which is between Orlando and Tampa. There was a pretty aggressive economic development team there that was like really trying to lure businesses, and I think that's sort of thing is what's needed. Also, what's needed though is I would say, I don't know, I've never been to. I hope I'm able to visit next month. It's just, and I'm not going to judge people and just overanalyze things. I'm just going to enjoy it, but just even the way people talk in their day-to-day life about their community, I think it's very important. If there's just kind of like, I've been, like I said, there's small midtowns that are just vibrant and awesome, and then there's just the doldrums, right?
Yeah.
And if there's like an established norm of being like, oh man, this place ain't going nowhere. We got to get out of here as soon as possible. This notion of just getting out. We're not going anywhere. The best days are over. Everything starts with your mind. We're people of faith. Everything begins with your mind, and then your words come from your mind.
Yes, so true.
So if there's this established norm in a particular community, I don't care if it's Kittanning or Donetsk, Ukraine. If it's this way of speaking, this way of communicating, of expressing yourself that is negative, I mean, it's all got to. You can have the best economic development team in City Hall, but if the overall language and narratives are negative, then it's not going to help.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's, for me, it's all mindset, because if you don't have a positive mindset, you're not going to see the opportunities around you. For someone, if someone had a significant amount of money and they wanted to come in and develop a small town, or they wanted to buy a significant amount of properties, or they wanted to, those kinds of things, Kittanning is a great spot to do that. Or if you want to start a small business, if your dream is to run a little sandwich shop, the trail in Kittanning is going to be a great spot to do that. But if all you're thinking about is just escaping, or this place is terrible, you'll never see that opportunity, not in a million years.
And you mentioned a trail, right? So that could be the anchor that the university, obviously we're talking about different scales, but nonetheless, I mean. If the universities were that anchor for Pittsburgh, then the trail could be the anchor for Kittanning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's the other thing we didn't talk about as far as universities is universities have the ability to train a new generation of workers for a new generation of work. And so as Pittsburgh transitioned from blue collar to other things, similarly, if Kittanning, we're not so much transitioning from blue collar, because the blue collar jobs that left, the population also left. So we're talking about just transitioning the economy from one to the other. We have a real potential here to be a tourism area, and to allow tourism to begin to fill the gap that's there economically, and to create a lot of different small business opportunities, which in my opinion, are the best opportunities. You get more control over your life, and you get more opportunity to see the value of your work very directly, that you don't have working for corporate America or working for whoever else.
Hey, you had mentioned that so there were attempts or people in the town who were promising some type of economic revival or project, and it was just it either didn't work out, or it was just an empty shell. You're saying there were cases like that?
Yeah, I think more it's empty promises. Like, a lot of people think, well, if we elect this person, they promise to lower taxes, and then they get in office and realize, oh wow, there's really not a lot of room here. And so it's like, when elections come about, yeah, they have all these promises of what they're going to do, but then when you get there and you get into the reality of the job, it's very different from what you thought it was.
There are ways of dealing with collective trauma. I think part of the reason there's this war in Ukraine is that there hasn't been enough. I think certain people, certain communities in Ukraine did do it in a constructive way, but then where the war is right now being waged, it's not. It wasn't handled the right way, because they're still clinging. That region where the war it's been going on for 5 years now, they're still clinging to communism. Like, they still wave the hammer and sickle flags. They still revere everything Soviet. Like, it's like a mini Soviet Union that insists on keeping things the same. And Russian President Putin has just taken advantage of it. He saw that, and he's like, okay, well, I can use this to my advantage, because then I can keep Ukraine, the whole country, in my orbit. I'm going to use these people to keep everyone stuck. And so how to deal with that trauma on a community level, on a collective level, is interesting. One quick example is well, besides tearing down Soviet statues, which was done in the last 10 years in many places in Ukraine, and by the way, we're seeing the tearing down of statues in the U.S., obviously there's people who feel traumatized by those statues and what they represent. There's other people who don't see things that way, and you know, ideally you want to resolve that democratically and not violently. But in Ukraine, that process did occur. But also people had like ceremonies, like there were various tragic periods in the Soviet experience. Like there's a Holodomor famine where collectivizations left millions of people starving, literally. And so they held candlelight vigils for that. To cope with that, to have people just express their feelings and their family memories about that. There's efforts being made still to this day of addressing Holocaust tragedies in Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory, and that's only been addressed in the last 10 years as well.
Wow.
By like having those related ceremonies and museums set up. So there's different. Now, obviously Kittanning, thankfully, didn't suffer such disastrous things like famines and concentration camps. But these are just some of the ways that some societies have kind of dealt with the past in order to, you know, you do the remembrance, the grievance stages. First is acknowledgement. Then there's the remembrance and discussion. Then there's the grievance. And then there's the, after the grievance, maybe some form of commemoration, like with a ceremony of some sort or some monument, you know. But then you have to move on, you know, and like Pittsburgh has done that. I don't know if Pittsburgh had to go through those stages and what was done,
Yeah.
but they've moved on. So
I think that's really interesting because there's a lot of I think that you're right that if these things are never dealt with, they just kind of get passed on to the next generation, and until a generation steps up and says, "Hey, we want to deal with this and move forward," I don't know that we ever will be able to, because like you said, it's up here. We have to change the mindset first. And I look at those things, and maybe that's a good question for the people that are listening to this, the people that are watching this. You know, what would be a way for us to collectively kind of move forward as a city? I know I've been a big proponent of, you know, we need a unifying vision for how to move forward, and that's when we talked about Kittanning 300. You know, that was kind of Mike and I's vision for like what could Kittanning be in the future. But maybe without those other things, without the first, I mean, you said acknowledgement first. I put thankfulness first because I want to put thankfulness before, because I want to be thankful that we didn't experience the Holocaust here and we didn't have, you know, these proxy wars and all these different things happening in our backyard. That hasn't been the case here. And so, of course, it could always be worse, right? No matter where you are. And then acknowledgement of where we are, remembrance, commemoration, and then how do we move forward? Or maybe we already have the path to move forward, but we have to do those other things to kind of lay the foundation for how to get people there. But it's super interesting conversation. Are you seeing that? So in some areas of Ukraine, you said have done that, and some areas have not, and the ones that have are kind of like they have a vision now and they're moving forward.
They're moving forward, but the people who haven't dealt with the Soviet Union and refuse to, the ones who are still clinging to the Soviet Union that doesn't exist and never will return, they're the ones who are holding back the country. Now, they're going to argue that, okay, well, their argument is how things were so great then, everyone had jobs, I could feed my family, everything was peaceful, and you know, part of the reason everything was peaceful because it was like a totalitarian
police state.
It's
Yeah.
like anyone who had opposition was just crushed.
Yeah.
But they insist that if we just replicate what had been in the past, then things would be. And they point to Belarus, by the way, which is north of Ukraine. It's between Lithuania and Ukraine. Belarus also has the hammer and sickle on its flag. It has a dictator who's been in place for like more than 20 years, and they still have collective farms where it's just, you don't own the farm, you go to a state farm and you perform your labor there. But a lot of Ukrainians will say, hey, that's, at least you get your salary and everything's quiet and you can feed your family. And those are the people holding things back from becoming like a more free market oriented, free economy, more dynamic economy. So that's why Ukraine has suffered so much, is that some want to move forward and others don't.
Man, that sounds so familiar. That is just like that is what we're continuing to run up against is, you lay out a vision for how to move forward, and then other people say, well, no, we just need to get one manufacturer that'll come in and provide 5,000 jobs again. And it's like, man, that's not going to happen. And we don't even have the demographics to support that, even if they would want to bring it here. It's like, it's gone, it's over. It's time to move forward. So it's super interesting how we're talking like large scale, okay, an entire nation of Ukraine and little Kittanning. But the collective trauma and what that does to the local psyche is still, we're still just people, right? It's still, human nature hasn't changed. But man, what an interesting conversation. I don't know if people listen to this find it interesting, but at the very least, I do. And I'm very glad that we met each other through the internet and have been able to talk like this. Is there anything else as we kind of wrap this up? Is there anything else that you'd like to say to people watching this at home and just from your perspective?
I would say that just based on my Google searches, Kittanning looks pretty damn cool. I noticed there's a downtown, there's a park, there's a pretty neat park downtown. There's a river that runs right through the city, which is also pretty cool. You mentioned coffee shops. I don't know, are they allowed to open with the virus situation?
They did just recently reopened a couple weeks ago, yeah.
The nature surrounding the town, the rural opportunities, like homesteading is definitely on the rise. It's especially among traditional minded people. And by the way, if there's anything I'd like to say is that just because you're a traditional person who believes in the traditional family and appreciates the foundations of America and American values, that doesn't mean that you have to be closed to change. I mean, change can occur without violating foundations, because if you ruin your foundation, that's when change is bad, when you ruin your foundations. And we believe that our foundations are our faith in God, in rule of law, in the institutions, in private property rights, the institutions that make America great. And so if you keep your foundations, but then you adapt, and what I mean by adapting economically, for instance, like, okay, my dad was a member of a union, by the way. That's something I'll never hope for.
Yeah.
But it had positives. Like he had health insurance. He had, strict rules on how much he could work. And that they couldn't force him to work overtime. And he had awesome vacations and awesome benefits. I don't deny that. I'm a right-wing guy, but I'm willing to acknowledge the benefits of the traditional labor union. And But okay, so now we know that those things are no longer available to my generation, to our generation, and future generations. Okay, so let's adapt. Let's look for healthcare outside of like your company or your union. Maybe there's like healthcare available in the free market. Maybe there's healthcare available in other countries. Like people, medical tourism is a booming business for more than a decade now. I mean, some people blame it for bringing disease to America, but it is what it is. I mean, you have to adapt. So there are, just because we're traditional minded people doesn't mean we can't adapt to the new realities of the economy and social life and culture. We don't necessarily have to be frankly destroyed by it.
Yeah, I think that's such a good word, as far as like, just because things are changing doesn't mean your foundation has to change. I think that is probably the greatest fear, is when you see all these changes happening around, you don't want your kids to grow up with different values and your grandkids to grow up in a place with different values. But the values can stay the same even if the method changes. We talk a lot about that at the church as well, Like the message has been the same for 2,000 years. We preach in the same sermons that they were preaching in Acts chapter 2. But at the same time, the method obviously has changed a whole lot because culture has changed. But we keep those foundational principles because that's who we are. And so that's such a good word to end this thing on. Don't be afraid of change, Kittanning. Don't be afraid of change, small town America. If we can embrace this thing and see what the opportunities are around us, man, the future has the potential to be really, really bright.
I agree, and I thank you for this opportunity just to share my experiences, and I hope to visit Kittanning next month.
Absolutely. Well, if you do, we'll make sure to have you in a video, and maybe we'll do a follow-up conversation after you're here for a minute and see if it's everything that it's cracked up to be.
And more.
Well, I just want to say, God bless you, my friend. I pray that God leads you right where He wants you to be, and hopefully we'll get to cross paths sooner than later. And certainly, if you need anything, give me a call.
Thank you.
All right, and for everyone watching this, I appreciate you taking the time. I know it's been an hour, but hopefully it's been interesting to get this very, very different perspective than what we're used to, and very, very valuable to me as well. So appreciate you guys watching, and as always, hopefully I'll see you in the next one sooner than later.